Okay, so the clock says it's time. Welcome everyone. My name is Ricardo Reis and I'm the director of the Center for Macroeconomics here at the LSE. It's an ESRC supported research center that works very closely with the Bank of England, among other institutions. And we're very delighted to organize this CEBRA annual conference. I'm here today speaking to you right now to welcome Hyun Shin, who's going to be the keynote lecturer of the conference. Hyun has been the economic advisor and the head of research at the BIS, the Bank for International Settlements, since May of 2014. Before that, he was on the faculty at Princeton University for a little shy of 10 years, where I had the great luxury of being his colleague. So for quite a few years, I was able to benefit from learning from Hyun, and that's really a luxury because Hyun has an incredibly broad knowledge and very diverse interests. Princeton, as well as many departments, often has different groups. You'd have the group of the micro, the macro economists, financial economists, or not, depending on your type of economist. But Hyun was really always where he's been, not just at Princeton, but also at the LSE and Oxford, he taught before, was really a member of the Department of Economics, since his work can easily be described as finance, macroeconomic theory, but in my view is just perhaps best described as that rarest of fields within economics, which is good economics. Hyun was and is the best kind of economic theorist with an ability to write very simple models that often only take elementary algebra to solve, but that really very sharply point to important insights about the economy works. He continues to do so, and today he will be talking about the economics of distributed ledger technology. Over the last couple of years, Hyun has looked to this topic and has written important papers from the perspective of economic history, with work on money and trust in the 17th century. He's taken the perspective of data, looking at the empirics of trade finance and trade credit. He's used economic theory to understand the role of the dollar in international finance, and also from the perspective of financial economics on important papers on the growing role of big tech. Today, Distributed Ledger Technologies. Hyun, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Ricardo. Thank you for that very generous introduction. And it's a great pleasure to connect with you again and to join everyone at the LSE, and also for all the participants in the CEBRA conference. Let me see if I can share my slides so that I can, I hope you can see that. I'd like to just give you some highlights of a research project that I've been doing with my colleague Raphael Auer here at the BIS, and Cyril Monet at University of Bern and the Study Center in Goethe. And Cyril was a visitor at the. He was actually on the staff of the BIS for the past year. Now back at the University of Bern, and it's touching on some fairly basic themes, but hopefully of interest to researchers and practitioners at the cutting edge as well. So let me start with just a basic observation that that money is a convention, and we can give it an economic treatment as an equilibrium where I accept money in payment in the expectation that others will do so when I need to buy something. So the fact that I'm holding money is a record of things that I've done in the past. So it's a record of goods that I've sold or of services that I've rendered. And it really doesn't matter what that history has been up to that point. It's just good enough that once we're in this equilibrium, the fact that I hold money is good enough for me to transact. Now, another way of doing this, perhaps in a more foundational way, is to think of doing it in the brute force way, if you like, where we can just record a complete list of transactions in a huge ledger that extends back in time. And so we can trace throughout history where that money has been, where that piece of money has been. And this would be another way of maintaining the interlocking web of promises that have sustained economic transactions. And in fact, in a very famous paper by Narayana Kocherlakota in the Journal of Economic Theory, more than 20 years ago, he titled the paper, "Money is Memory." And the main idea there is this convention of money, it does almost as well. It sort of does pretty much everything that this brute force ledger would actually do. So in a society where you're returning a favor, the piece of money is a kind of IOU that you can actually then pay back when someone else returns that favor. Now, of course, imagine lugging around this huge ledger. Of course, this is, if it's in paper form, it would be a very large ledger indeed. And it has to be a ledger that's accessible to everyone, that's common knowledge. So it's really quite a fanciful notion if we were to think about it in the analog technology days. But the tantalizing prospect has been that advances in computing and cryptography may have brought such a ledger closer to reality. So is it in fact now possible that we can, as it were, go back and recreate this brute force way of keeping track of all the transactions in the economy? And in fact, we can think of blockchain technology as a way of doing this. So here's a diagram where we think of the blockchain as a digital book, and we write each page, and we append each page as we accumulate new transactions. And this is a book that's commonly accessible to everyone, and we can refer to it to see whether someone's claim on resources is actually justified, is actually a genuine one. It raises all kinds of questions, like how do you update, and what is the procedure? And in fact, the debate about Bitcoin and the way that you can recreate this ledger in a permissionless way, I think is a very important advance in this discussion. So if you recall, there is a Bitcoin white paper written by Satoshi Nakamoto, this famous individual or individuals who doesn't have it hasn't been identified. But this white paper lays down a set of rules whereby you can sustain this ledger where transactions are gathered and then assembled at the end. Now, a very important paper by Bruno Billet and some colleagues, which was published last year, shows that this Bitcoin protocol, these set of rules, in fact constitutes an equilibrium in a game theoretic sense. In other words, if everyone else were to follow the rules as laid down in the protocol, then it is in my best interest to follow the rule itself. So what that means is this set of rules is a self-sustaining arrangement where you don't need an external authority to impose these actions on you. It is in your interest to play your part in sustaining this convention. Now, it's a permissionless system in that anyone can join. Of course, your identity is masked by your alias, but anyone can look into the history of all the transactions. Of course, the file is becoming larger and larger over time, but this is a kind of pure version of this brute force way of keeping track of all transactions that have happened in the past. Now, there are some limitations of Bitcoin as money, and I will not spend too much time on some of the arguments that have been laid out. But there are issues to do with scalability. There are issues to do with the finality of the payments. But possibly from a more practical perspective, the biggest impediment is the very fact that it's a system where everyone has an alias, but your real identity is masked. So it runs counter to the principles of transparency, anti-money laundering, etc. And so instead, the same kind of principle of the same kind of spirit of trying to recreate the convention of money through a ledger has been done through what's called permissioned distributed ledger technology. And there is often a special role for the central bank. But the updating of the ledger is done by a group of validators, typically. And the updating of the ledger itself is done by a supermajority of the validators agreeing which transactions are genuine or not. So if you like a supermajority, a given threshold, typically it's between 75 to 80%, depending on the particular platform, is the arbiter of truth. So what is true or not is a matter of what the supermajority of the validators say. And these permission DLTs have found widespread application, and many central banks are now experimenting with such systems for central bank digital currencies, and there are many other non-money applications, as in trade finance and in security settlement. And it is very well suited for these applications because it is, after all, a database. It is a database that is distributed, and it has many of the desirable properties that I'll go on to now. And the equilibrium properties of these permission DLTs are now becoming better known as we delve into these protocols in more detail. And in fact, there's a paper on the program tomorrow which looks at these permission DLTs and asks, can we actually think of them as the rules, as describing the strategies that form an equilibrium in a game. And in this particular paper, they also look at the presence of so-called Byzantine players whose sole mission is to frustrate and to undermine the working of this of the particular program. So it's a case of seeing how large the supermajority must be in order for the system to work, even when there are malicious players. So one way to depict this would be in terms of this diagram. So the stylized way of looking at this would be, at a certain point in time, we have the ledger of all the past transactions. And then a group of validators here in the white lab coats examine the ledger and then say, yes, this person who is about to pay the money is entitled to that money, and says, yes, go ahead, you can pay person B. And then this payment is then written into the book. And in the next period, this transaction is recorded on the next page. You can certainly refine this. So if you wanted to preserve the anonymity of money, you can also rely on some kind of cryptographic technique to make sure that anyone who comes after this transaction cannot then recreate the history of transactions. So when it comes time for B to pay C, C will not be able to tell that it was A who actually paid individual B. This is a very stylized way of doing it. And these permission DLTs have become much talked about, especially given the impetus that they've received with a greater attention given to central bank digital currencies. And this is a chart that came from our special chapter in the annual economic report. The title is Central Banks and the New World of Payments. It's a broad overview of the role of the central bank in the payment system. But there is a discussion of CBDCs, central bank digital currencies. And one thing that we see from the number of speeches given by central bankers is that the stance towards CBDCs used to be fairly negative or neutral, given by these downward pointing red bars. But from the middle of last year onwards, we've seen this big increase in the blue bars, which are speeches which tend to be taking a more positive stance. The dark blue bars are the retail CBDCs, which are for general use. And the light blue bars are for wholesale CBDCs. These are for the financial institutions that typically already have access to the central bank balance sheet. This discussion has always been around, but the notable change in the last year or so has been the increase in the attention to retail CBDCs. And if you have time, I would also highly recommend this working paper that we put out a couple of weeks ago, which gives not only the broad overview, but goes into a number of special examples, number of specific cases of central bank digital currencies, and discusses the approaches and the difference in the technologies. Now, in a broad way, what is the advantage of having distributed ledgers as opposed to centralized ledgers? So when we going back to our discussion of this huge ledger that we lug around, wouldn't it be easier if we just had one trusted person who maintains that ledger, perhaps a central bank, rather than trying to have some kind of construct an equilibrium where everyone plays their part and the ledger is updated in a decentralized way? Well, one argument for having a decentralized or a distributed ledger is that robustness, there's a certain degree of robustness that comes from the redundancy. So having lots and lots of different copies, each maintained by a different validator, will give you that resilience that, even if one or more nodes might not function, you can still have the other copies. Now, this robustness clearly is more than simply about keeping copies of the ledger in a safe place, because even for a centralized ledger, you could have lots of different copies and stored safely. There is also an important element of governance here, in that the validators each play a role in the governance of the system by offering checks and balances on each other, that they're all doing the right thing. So through this equilibrium, we can also ensure better governance. That's a kind of sort of broader argument. And the argument here is, well, if it's someone that you really, really trust, then it may be okay to have a centralized ledger. But this ledger is an enormously consequential thing in society. It has the history of all transactions, so that if you have command over this ledger, it gives you a great deal of privilege and power over everyone else in society. So I think there is a sort of sense that it avoids this all-in risk, if you like, that you can put eggs in more than one basket. Now, the downside, and this is where I'll focus the rest of this presentation, is that this resilience and this these sets of advantages given by checks and balances don't come cheap. And the reason is you have to have the wherewithal to maintain the protocol, to maintain the rules and the updating of the ledger as an equilibrium. And in order to do that, you have to have the incentives of all the validators be fully aligned. And that means that often you need to have some rents that are appropriated by the validators, or there must be some other way of keeping the incentives. Now, well known, and this can lead to inefficiencies in an economic sense. So it's allocative inefficiencies where either no one appropriates the gains, or indeed, there are very severe distributional consequences. So, a good example of this is the proof of work in the Bitcoin protocol, where the idea is, so the Bitcoin protocol works by asking all the miners so these are the validators, the bookkeepers, to engage in a competition to solve mathematical puzzles, not because these puzzles are, not because the solutions of these puzzles are valuable in their own right, but rather that solving this puzzle can only be done by brute force. And so who wins this contest is really a matter of luck, is really a matter of chance and how much computing power you actually devote to it. And from an economist's point of view, this is nothing more than a fancy randomization device. It's a randomization device to select the miner who will have the privilege of updating the ledger and collect any rewards that are associated with updating. So if the users have offered to pay something to have their records, to have their transactions recorded, then you can scoop up those payments, and you can also be rewarded by by new units of Bitcoin as well. But of course, so this is enough to construct that equilibrium that I mentioned earlier by Bruno Bier and colleagues. But it is hugely wasteful in terms of computing power. So this is an example of some inefficiency costs that are entailed by trying to construct the updating mechanism as an equilibrium in a game. And it turns out that this type of inefficiency is a pretty general result, even for permissioned distributed ledgers. And this is going to be the main point of the talk. So the main result is that maintaining a monetary equilibrium in a permissioned DLT system entails considerable rents for the validators, and it has to be high enough to sustain the updating rules as a monetary equilibrium. Now, it turns out that if the economic gains that come from the institution of money is not large enough, then of course, there is no distributed ledger that can actually, secure those gains, because the inefficiency rents are too large to sustain. If the gains are large enough, then of course there are going to be distributional consequences. That the gains will go to the validators rather than to the users themselves, or in the case of Bitcoin, they will be dissipated. So no one actually appropriates the the gains. So that's where we're headed. We in the paper we go a little bit beyond this. We actually pose the question of what is this trade-off between governance and efficiency. And it turns out that it is actually quite a complex. The terms of that trade-off turn out to be fairly complex. But for the purpose of this presentation, I'd like to focus on one issue in particular, which is the public good contribution game formalized as a global game. So let me just give you a preview of the result. So what we do is we solve the validators problem well, we model the validators problem as a game where the validators are given certain rewards by participating in the validation scheme. We will have a supermajority rule where whatever the supermajority, so that whenever the designated supermajority of the validators deem a transaction to be valid, and that is the truth, that if you like, what the validators deem to be true is the truth. And we solve this game using global game techniques, where we assume that the validators have slightly different costs of validation. And we can solve for a unique equilibrium, which also turns out to be dominant solvable. So it's a very robust prediction that unanimity is going to be too stringent for a threshold for consensus. In other words, if you were to imagine a supermajority consisting of the whole group, in other words, everyone has to agree in order for a transaction to be valid. Well, this is not going to happen. In no equilibrium will you actually have this coming up. In general, the higher the supermajority threshold, the larger is the rent collected by the validators. In other words, if you want to ensure a greater degree of robustness to malicious attacks by requiring a very high supermajority in order to validate a particular transaction, this is going to be a system which is going to be very inefficient in that you have to pay the validators a large sum. And in general, the outcome is going to be very sensitive to the validators' costs in maintaining a clean, reconciled ledger. So the idea here is maintaining this book, maintaining this ledger is a public good. And the validators are going to be playing a public good contribution game where they incur the costs to actually maintain this ledger. And to do this in a way that makes monetary equilibrium come about as an outcome in the in the economy, you need to give them very large rewards. So let me just give you a very high-level summary of the model. We have time that's discrete, and everyone is going to be discounting the future at this rate beta. Actually, why don't I go straight to the diagram and just explain it through this diagram. So we have a ledger, and it's a distributed. It's using a group of validators who votes by supermajority to deem a particular transaction as being valid or not. And each period is divided into an early period and a late period. In the early period, one type of individual produces. And then in the second period, in the late period, at that date, this type B, this late producer is also going to reciprocate and produce something in return, and there's going to be an exchange. So in the first production stage, A transfers some resources to B. And in this one-shot game, there is nothing to stop B from then reneging on the promise made in the first period. However, what is going to happen is that some of the late producers form a committee, and these are the validators, and they can check whether B actually fulfilled his promise. And so if the supermajority of these validators say yes, B did hold up his end of the bargain, then that fact is then written in to the next page of the ledger, and then the next period starts. So there is room for beneficial trade between individuals here. So the first best is that individuals transact in this way. The only friction is that there is an incentive problem where the late producer needs to have this enforcement mechanism, if you like, someone to check up on the fact that he held up his end of the bargain. So that's so this is a basic structure. We also examine the broader question of what if these validators are actually vulnerable to being bribed, if you like. What if there are side payments that can be paid? What would be the best validation scheme in that case? We go through a number of examples. We bring out some general results, but this is not going to be covered in my presentation today. I'm just going to be focusing on this case, which is about the production of the public good, which is the ledger on the right-hand side. We want to produce a clean, reconciled ledger, which is going to be the foundation for this exchange economy. So here's the validators game, and let me just describe it in a very, very simple way. So the validators have a binary action. So it's a binary action game. They can either work or they can shirk. And working here entails verifying and then communicating the labels so that these labels can be gathered and see whether there is a supermajority that agree. But this task of verifying and communicating, let's say, incurs some cost called chi. This can be potentially fairly small, but it's important that there is a positive cost, albeit small. Now, the rules of the game are that provided that a supermajority, kappa hat, actually work, then their reports will coincide because they can see what the truth is and they can write down what they see. They can all put their reports on a table, and if supermajority kappa or more work, the reports will coincide, and each of the validators will collect some share of the surplus. So here the surplus is 1 minus f, and f is some noise. We need to get the model working, and z is the crucial term. So z is the payment that can be scaled up and down that is paid to the validators. So if z were 1, then the validators will capture the whole of the surplus. If z were 0, then of course they would capture none. But as you'll see, we will indeed have z being non-zero. And so here are the payoffs to the game. The payoffs to the game, so the payoff to working depends on whether you have a supermajority who work or not. So provided that proportion kappa or more, provided that proportion kappa hat or more actually work and do what they're supposed to do, then we can create this public good. We can actually update the ledger successfully, in which case you're going to be incurring this cost kappa. You're going to be incurring this cost chi, but of course you will be capturing this this surplus. If you work, but not enough of the others actually work, then of course you just incur the cost, but you have no benefit. So this is a risky action. It really depends on whether there are enough of the other validators who join you in validating the transaction as to whether you collect the high payoff or not. The payoff to shirking is simple. It's just 0. So this is the safe action, if you like. You're just guaranteed 0. And so you can just stay at home, do not incur any effort, and you're guaranteed 0. So the choice is between, do you want to take the chance of working and a chance of collecting this high payoff, or would you just prefer to stay out? Now, if you look at this, if you look at these payoffs, and here chi is small. Provided that everyone works, everyone can guarantee this high payoff, 1 minus fz minus chi. So in a complete information game, there would be an equilibrium where everyone works, because you either work or you shirk. If everyone works, everyone gets this high payoff, and that's better than getting zero. So there is an equilibrium where everyone works. Equally, there is a bad equilibrium where if you are concerned that no one will actually turn up and do what they're supposed to do, then my just turning up by myself is not going to achieve that achieve the supermajority of the validators to perform their roles, and I'm going to get something negative, minus chi. And if that's the case, 0 is better than minus chi, and therefore I will stay at home. So there's also an equilibrium where everyone shirks. So this is a typical multiple equilibrium type setting, which is crying out for some global game analysis to actually refine and to anchor the outcome to the underlying fundamentals. So how can we simplify this model? Well, let's just normalize the payoff so that we can simplify the payoffs even further. So just divide all the payoffs by this high payoff, 1 minus f times z. And so CI is going to be this normalized cost. And then the reward is just going to be 1. So the payoff to work is going to be 1 minus CI if a supermajority do what they're supposed to do. And it's going to be minus C if there are not enough. And the payoff to shirk is 0, as before. Now, the interpretation of C here is that it is a normalized cost. It is the cost normalized by the benefit. And so C can be small, either if you can lower the cost, chi, or if you appropriate more of the surplus. And as you'll see, this comparative static with respect to C is going to be really crucial. It will turn out that if C is small enough, you can actually achieve the good equilibrium. You can actually achieve the good outcome. But if the cost is fixed, that can only be achieved by giving a lot of the surplus, handing over a lot of the surplus to the validators. The way that we're going to be formalizing this global game is to do it in this way. So imagine that there's a common component in the cost across the validators, called that theta. But everyone's cost is very similar, but differs by very small amounts around this common component. So my cost, C of I, is this common component plus a small noise term, which is, well, it's a kind of, not a noise term, but an idiosyncratic term, E to I, which we'll assume is uniform and IID over a small interval, minus epsilon plus epsilon. And what we're going to do is to take limits where we take epsilon to 0, so that in the limit, everyone has the same cost. But it's going to turn out, as you know, that for the global game formulation, it will make a world of difference to the strategic uncertainty by taking this, this kind of formulation. So that's the setup. And the crucial step in the solution is this result, which is that, first of all, imagine that everyone is following a switching strategy around a common cost C star. So in other words, just imagine for the moment that everyone is following a rule where if its cost falls below this threshold C star, then you work. If your cost is above the C star, then you shirk. And imagine that everyone is following exactly the same strategy around this given threshold C star. And imagine that C star is somewhere in the interior, so it's strictly between 0 and 1. Now, imagine that you find yourself exactly at that switching point. So I draw a cost level that turns out to be exactly C star, and you ask the question, imagine everyone is, I know that everyone is following this switching strategy. What is the density over the proportion of validators who are actually contributing to this public good? Because this is a very important question for me, because I would like to know how many of the other validators are actually contributing. If everyone is contributing, I would like to contribute. If everyone is not contributing, I would like to also refrain from contributing. And in general, there'll be some density over the proportion who contribute. And I would like to know what that density is. Well, in this case, in that limit as epsilon tends to 0, the limit turns out to be uniform over the unit interval. In other words, if I ask the question, my cost level is C star exactly, my belief about this random variable, kappa, which gives me the proportion of other validators who are actually contributing, my belief actually follows a uniform density. And the intuition for this is to think of this in terms of a thought experiment where I ask, where am I in the queue? So everyone has very, very small differences in costs. I can observe my cost, and I ask, what is the probability that I'm the one with the highest cost? What is the probability that I'm the one with the second highest cost, and so on? Because and that information is going to be very important, because if I'm exactly at that switching point, I know that everyone who has a cost level below me will be contributing, and everyone who has a cost level above me will not be contributing. So if I have the distribution over these order statistics, then I know exactly. Then I can form a belief about the probability that the other validators are contributing. And as the noise, as this idiosyncratic component goes to 0, the information that's captured in the prior distribution over theta becomes irrelevant. And the only thing that matters is this uniform idiosyncratic component. And in fact, I have equal probability that I'm the highest, the second highest, third highest, and so on. And what that means is the proportion of the validators that have, so the weight that I put on the proportion of validators that have a cost lower than me is exactly uniform. I put equal probability on there being, on everyone contributing, on everyone except one contributing, everyone except two contributing, all the way down to no one contributing. So it's uniform. Now, this is a tremendous, bonus for us, because we can really solve, we can really use this very constructively in solving for the gain. And this is the way you would solve for the gain. So we would like to, first of all, find a switching point whereby I'm exactly indifferent between contributing and not contributing. If I can find such a cost level, then I'd be indifferent, and the only thing that would lead to one action or the other would be a tie break. But I know that everyone else that has a cost level above me will observe that this person is to the right of the switching point, and this person will not contribute, and everyone to the left has a cost level lower, and these people will contribute. And so we can construct this equilibrium in switching strategies. Now, the fact that the belief over kappa is uniform means that we have a very simple procedure to solve this game. So here is the payoff function of contributing as a function of kappa, as a function of the proportion of the other validators who actually contribute. So provided that kappa is falling below the threshold kappa hat, then I will be just wasting my effort, because there isn't a supermajority who will actually contribute. So I will get the payoff minus C. If, on the other hand, kappa is above kappa hat, then there is enough, there is a critical mass of validators who exceed this threshold kappa hat. And I'm among the supermajority, therefore I can actually collect on a high payoff. Now, if the belief is uniform, then all we need to check is whether this rectangle A is larger or smaller than this rectangle B. So at the switching point, these two rectangles will be of exactly the same size. So that will be what we're looking at, because if the cost level was smaller than that, then the rectangle A would be, so this wouldn't be a switching point. This would be a switching point because the two rectangles will be of exactly the same size. So here's another way of just writing it out in terms of the equation. So the payoff to work, given my cost level Ci, exactly at C star, is going to be the payoff conditional on the public good not being successfully provided, which is the first term, plus the payoff when the public good is successfully provided, which is the second term. And the fact that the density over kappa is uniform means that this cumulative distribution function, this CDF, is just a 45-degree line. So if we just integrate up the uniform density, we just get the 45-degree line. And so the equation that characterizes the switching point is nothing other than this very simple equation here. So the switching point is nothing other than 1 minus the critical threshold. So this is the picture. Let's see. So on the horizontal axis, we're measuring this critical threshold for the supermajority. And on the vertical axis, we want to plot that critical cost level at which any validator will be indifferent between contributing and not contributing. Now, clearly, if your cost level is below this critical level, you will want to contribute because the noise is very small. And if everyone is switching at C star and I have a cost level below C star, then I would like to contribute. So any area below this red line is going to be associated with a successful provision of the public good. So it's provided that the cost level is below that red line, we will have an equilibrium outcome where the public good is provided. So formally, as we take the limit as this idiosyncratic term goes to 0, there is in fact, this switching equilibrium, which turns out to be also the unique and dominant solvable equilibrium. And the way that we would show this is to say, well, there are dominance regions. That's one of the assumptions we use at the beginning. And then we can use the deletion of strictly dominated strategies to work our way towards this switching strategy, this unique switching point at C star. And it turns out to be the only equilibrium outcome. So not only is it the only switching equilibrium, it is the only equilibrium full stop. So one way to just depict this outcome is in terms of this diagram. So depending on the threshold for the supermajority, whether you actually successfully update the ledger or not, whether you have a system that is going to be sustainable as an equilibrium or not, depends on the cost level. If the cost level is high, then you will not be able to sustain this arrangement as an equilibrium. It has to be low enough for any given level of the threshold for you to be able to sustain it. So for example, if you were to be on this higher red dot, so if you found yourself here, so you wanted a critical threshold which is relatively high because that has very desirable features that have to do with resilience against Byzantine attacks and so on, then it had better be the case that the cost level is very, very low. Because if you're up there, here, then you will not be able to sustain this updating of the ledger as an equilibrium. What you need to do is to bring C down. And remember, C can be brought down either by reducing the physical cost, which is going to be very difficult, or by giving more of the surplus to the validators. So what this means is you need to give enough of the surplus to the validators in order for this arrangement to be sustained as an equilibrium. And there's another sort of fairly strong result here. If ever you were to require unanimity to update this ledger, then just forget it, because this public good will never be provided. And you can see it from here. If you want unanimity, we're looking at this point here. What cost level is consistent with successful provision when there's unanimity? Well, the cost level has to be 0. And that can never happen, because chi is always going to be positive, and however large the surplus is, you can never actually reach reach 0. The denominator is always going to be finite. So this is actually, I think, a sort of fairly pessimistic result for unanimity, in that unanimity can never be guaranteed. So unanimity can never be part of a permission DLT system. And in general, the higher the supermajority threshold that you need, or that you would like, more of the surplus has to go to the validators. And by implication, less will be there for the users. So let me just conclude with just going back to a couple of the slides that I showed you earlier. And hopefully second time round, some of these statements will make some more sense. One thing that I mentioned was that robustness that comes from this redundancy is a big advantage. And the checks and balances are also a big advantage. But the costs loom very large for these distributed systems, especially if you want to ensure that the incentives are aligned so that you can actually operate these kind of systems as robust equilibria of a game. And this is going to be very important, because typically in applications, we are thinking of these validators as market participants. These will be financial institutions, designated market participants, who will be, will be wearing this this hat as validators, and we have to think of them as self-interested individual participants who will respond to incentives. And if the incentives are not there, they will not step up in the way that the protocol would actually suggest. And so the main result, I think, gives us, I think, very broad outlines of what might be feasible. I think there is a general inefficiency result, which potentially can be quite troubling here, which is that, as we know in these global games, we can never ensure that the Pareto efficient equilibrium is always played, even though that Pareto efficient equilibrium is there. And depending on the information structure, you have to leave some of the surpluses on the table in order that you give enough incentive, in spite of the strategic uncertainty, that the participant players will actually play their part in the equilibrium. In this particular example, what we're saying is that either the costs have to be very small physically, so we have to somehow tweak the technology so that the costs are very, very small, or we have to give sufficient incentives, sufficient rents to the validators, or both, in order that we can sustain this arrangement as an equilibrium. So this trade-off is actually, I think, quite a difficult one, because yes, there are huge advantages to do with redundancy and the checks and balances, but it also comes with potentially very large costs. And I think, so if you read the Auer et al. Working paper that I referenced at the very beginning, They give you specific examples of central bank digital currency experiments that are now ongoing. We know that some central banks, like the People's Bank of China, have opted not to use a distributed ledger design, but instead have chosen a centralized design. I think there the motivation is really about the physical capacity more than anything else. But that kind of system would be much more robust to these inefficiencies that I've just described. On the other hand, it's going to have the downsides of the centralized system, which have to do with the fact that there'll be less in terms of checks and balances. You had really better trust the central bank in order that we can keep all this data, all this information, all the eggs in one basket. And we don't have the benefit of this redundancy from having a network. So those are some broad conclusions that I would draw. And so, Ricardo, let me finish there with maybe a couple of minutes to spare.
Great, thank you very much, Hyun. I was going to use, we have 4 minutes to spare, so I was going to use it to raise 2 questions that have been raised while you were speaking, and then give you a couple of minutes to answer.
Sure.
First question comes from, well, apologies to those asking the questions. I'll ask them and read what you read just so that it's a little more efficient. So the first question from Galina Hale, who asks, in addition to economic cost benefit outline, I suggest we should add a huge external cost of this because of energy expenses needed for mining and resulting environmental costs. In most places, energy prices do not include environmental costs.
Yeah.
Second question comes from Martin Van Hoort, who asks, do you also study what would happen if there would be more than one permissioned DLT and there is competition among permissioned DLTs? If there were competition, then there'll be incentives for payers and payees to leave a DLT for another if the validators are bribed. And it seems much competition among permissioned DLTs could further discipline validators. So Hyun, if you could take 3 minutes to address both competition as well as potential external effects of the energy consumption associated with validation.
Very good, thank you, Ricardo. So on Galina's question, which was on the energy cost, I think that's a very good question. I mentioned it in passing when we were discussing the proof of work for Bitcoin. The proof of work is one way of aligning incentives of the miners to do what they're supposed to do under the protocol. But it is an inefficiency from the perspective of the users, and it's a huge inefficiency from the point of view of society as well. So I think that's a good example of, if you like, an inefficiency that aids, that supports better incentives of the miners, but it's going to be hugely costly. So that's a cost that is not appropriated by any of the parties. What I described in the model that I described today is more about the inefficiency that has to do with giving more rents to the validators. So, ideally, we would like to lower those rents because if the spirit is to recreate physical cash, but just in digital form, then we would like to have this feature of cash, which is that once the cash is there in the hand, other than just the cost of handling it, it will not be something that is going to impinge on efficiency. On the competition between DLT platforms, that's a very I think intriguing thought. I would say 2 things about that. The nature of the monetary equilibrium as a convention means that there would be agglomeration effects where the more users flock to one platform, the larger the gains will be. And so, in fact, we would see a tendency, and indeed the equilibrium will shift in such a way that there should be a tipping point where one of the platforms win. And it's not clear that the rents for the validators will be the only criterion. I think the other point I would make is even if the competition would persuade a single validator, it's not clear that the validators themselves, if they were to operate in a decentralized way, would be able to internalize this competitive effect there. So it's not clear to me that just by having competition, we can solve this problem.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much. We're spot on time. So let me thank in the name of everyone. I guess we can't have an applause, but I'll just emphatically use words to say thank you very much, Hyun. That was extremely insightful and very useful. And so thank you for doing that. And for everyone else listening in, we're going to take a short 5-minute break just to let the next panel members log in and sort things out. And we will start sharply in 4 or 5 minutes. Thank you. Bye-bye.